All right, today we're jumping into something pretty wild. It's a trip report, but not just any trip report. This one starts with a simple sensory experience and somehow ends up with this massive, radical theory about the entire future of humanity. So yeah, let's get into it. And this quote right here is really the heart of where it all began. It wasn't about seeing crazy things or hallucinating. It was this feeling of restoration, like getting back to that state of childlike wonder, wiping away what he calls this aged numbness that we all kind of get. Now, this wasn't just some random experience. The dose was super precise, 24.9 milligrams of psilocybin. And what's interesting is that this is the exact kind of dose they're using in clinical trials right now. So it kind of grounds this whole very personal, very out there story in some real-world science. So you can see how it starts off really personal, right? All about the senses, but that was just the doorway. That experience led to this huge shift in thinking, sparking an idea that seriously questions the very foundation of, well, everything. How we live, what we think is possible, the whole shebang. Okay, so let's start at the beginning with the physical experience. What did it actually feel like? Well, the description is just this exhilarating feeling of being totally hyper-aware and hyper-alive. First up, touch. It's like it was completely rediscovered. Think about it. Simple things, like just rubbing your fingers together, suddenly felt brand new, totally fascinating. His body felt strong, nimble, and every little texture, every movement, just lit up his brain in a way it hadn't in years. And it wasn't just touch. Music, it just hit differently, way more deeply. The way light was reflecting on a simple glass of water was suddenly mesmerizing. And food? Even a basic salad tasted like the most incredible, delicious thing he'd ever eaten. It was like all the senses were just turned up to 11. Then something kind of weird happened. This feeling of absolute stillness came over him. He felt so in control of his body that it seemed like his heart had just stopped. He literally couldn't feel his own pulse. But here's the kicker. He checks his wearable, and his heart rate is totally normal, chugging along in the mid-50s. What a bizarre disconnect between what you're feeling and what's actually happening, right? So, the big takeaway from this first part is that feeling, the sense that his consciousness was dialed all the way up to a 10 out of 10. Just hyper-aware, hyper-alive, with every single sense firing on all cylinders. Okay, so that's the sensory part. Now let's get into how this factory reset led to something so much bigger. Once all the senses were recalibrated, his focus shifted. It moved from the texture of existence, the sights and sounds, to existence itself. And this slide really nails the core insight he had. We spend pretty much our whole lives playing what he calls the games, our jobs, politics, all the personal drama, trying to climb the status ladder. But here's the thing. All of these games, every single one, is built on this one unspoken foundation, the assumption that we are all going to die, that it's inevitable. And because we've just accepted this as a fact of life, we've come up with all these ways to cope with it, right? We have ideas like heaven or reincarnation. We chase a legacy through our work or our kids. There's even existentialism. At the end of the day, these are all just frameworks to make the idea of dying a little less terrifying, maybe even make it sound like a good thing, a virtue. Which brings us to the next big idea. This is where it gets really radical. What happens if that foundation, the one that all of our games are built on, what if it starts to crack? What if it crumbles? And here it is. This is the central question that the whole experience unlocked, a direct challenge to the most fundamental rule we live by. What if death is not inevitable? What if that rule could actually be changed? Now, we got to be clear here. This isn't really about immortality in the way we usually think of it. Living forever just as we are right now. No, the idea is way more profound than that. It's about a radical remake, a complete re-engineering of what it even means to be human. And look, this isn't just some sci-fi fantasy. The argument is that for the very first time in human history, we actually have the tools that make this stuff seem plausible. You've got AI exploding, insane advances in biology, breakthroughs in medicine, and we can literally edit our own DNA. All of this stuff coming together is opening up a frontier of possibilities we've never seen before. I love this quote because it really puts the scale of all this into perspective. Are we basically cavemen right now compared to what humans could be like in just 50 years? It makes you wonder, right? Maybe our whole understanding of life's limits is just primitive. Maybe the crazier idea is to limit our imagination, not to expand it. So, okay, let's say this massive change is possible. How in the world does a shift that big actually happen in society? I mean, how do we, as a species, just wake up and ditch a belief we've held for our entire history? Well, the theory uses this great analogy, the idea of sour grapes. You know the old fable, right? When you want something you think you can't have, what do? You make up a story about why you never really wanted it anyway. We build these whole moral frameworks just to convince ourselves it wasn't that great to begin with. And you can see this playing out in the real world right now. Think about weight. For a long time, the dominant cultural idea was body positivity, a sour grapes framework in a way. But then a practical path appears, GLP-1 drugs. And boom, the entire conversation changes like overnight. The theory is the exact same thing is going to happen with aging. Right now, acceptance is seen as a virtue. But the second a practical way to reverse aging shows up, that whole idea is probably going to just evaporate.
And if you look at history, you see this pattern again and again. Big revolutions in thinking happen when a society's core beliefs just don't line up with reality anymore. The system breaks, it fractures, and something new rushes in to fill the void. The argument here is that we are living through one of those moments right now, a crisis of meaning, a crisis of despair, that's creating a vacuum for the next big idea.
So the key point is this isn't some far-off future thing. It's happening now. You can feel it. Our systems are fractured, they're unstable, and that's creating this huge opening for a totally new kind of meaning, a new purpose to grab hold. And it's all being sped up by the insane pace of technology. So this all leads to the final big vision. If we actually do this, if we wake up and reject the idea that death is inevitable, what happens then? What does that society even look like? Who do we look up to? Who are our heroes? Well, a brand new human archetype would emerge, the warriors and caretakers of existence. Imagine a world where the highest status doesn't go to the person with the most money or the most followers. Instead, it goes to the people who are defiant of death. The ones who see self-destruction as, primitive, low status. The people who dedicate their lives to making sure humanity continues. They would be our new idols. And so, to wrap this all up, let's just flip the whole thing on its head. We're always told that accepting death is a sign of wisdom, of maturity. But what if that's completely backwards? What if our acceptance is really just a psychological defense mechanism, a shield we use to protect ourselves from the massive disappointment of knowing we can't achieve our full potential? Something to think about.